But more concerning, it's very, very hard to identify. It's hard for a brand to know where they sit in a consumer's mindset. And that, to me, is the kind of nuanced, more interesting part than the bright flame of everyone yelling cancer and hashtag boycott, whatever the brand is.
Hey gang, it's Thursday, April 21. Dave and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an e-marketer podcast made possible by mParticle. I'm Marcus. Today I'm joined by our principal analyst who heads up our marketing practice. It's Dave Frankland.
Hey Marcus, great to be here.
Hello there, sir. Thank you so much for hanging out today. Today's fact, this one may or may not have been personalised just for you. The first person processed at Ellis Island was...
Annie Moore.
Oh, I don't know why I do. You always know these.
I have a funny anecdote on this though.
Oh, amazing. Wait, so go on, you go.
So she's a 16-year-old from Cove, County Cork, right? There's a statue of her both in Cove in Ireland as well as prior to Sandy, at least on Ellis Island. But there's a bar, you know it's going to come back to a bar with me. There's a bar on, I think it's 45th Street, called Annie Moore's. I was taken there my first couple of days in New York, and I actually didn't know who she was prior to that. And I thought it was a pun on Annie Moore alcohol. Annie Moore. And that's when I first learned who Annie Moore was.
Sorry, Annie, for Dave's behaviour. You're spot on. Annie Moore, January 1st, 1892, the first passenger to disembark on Ellis Island on its opening day. She travelled to the US with her two younger brothers aboard the SS Nevada, departing from that town that Dave pronounced that I can't pronounce in Ireland. And she was the first of 17 million Irish to be processed at Ellis Island.
Amazing
Anyway,
for a country of 4 million people.
Yes. That's remarkable.
And for visitors to New York, Ellis Island is always worth a visit. Skip the Statue of Liberty and go to Ellis Island.
I never went. I lived in New York for like 7 years. I never went. I'm the worst person. Anyway, today's real topic. How much should brands be wary of cancel culture? Nina Lentini of Marketing Dive notes a few prominent examples of how cancel culture can come for brands. Number one, last year, privately owned Goya faced calls for a national boycott of its products after Goya Foods CEO Robert Unanu's vocal support for Donald Trump following the 2020 election. Second example is last summer, employees of Activision Blizzard, which makes games like Call of Duty, walked out protesting the company's response to a California lawsuit, charging it with discrimination and harassment against women in the workplace. This led to the resignation of the company's president. But is cancel culture trouble for brands or just noise? Asks Miss Lentini of Marketing Dive. According to a recent Forrester report, cancel culture is loud, but for most brands, it is just noise. And although cancel culture has proliferated across society, aided by social media and partisanship, its impact is nominal, affecting people more than companies. Dave, what are your thoughts on this takeaway?
So I think there's some validity to the idea that this is noise, but that doesn't mean it isn't trouble. You know, news cycles are evolving so fast. You know, things don't last that long. Elon Musk decides to buy Twitter and nobody's talking about Will Smith. These are flames that burn really, really brightly, but extinguish fairly quickly. So that's the noise side of it. I think the trouble, it's worth bearing in mind the impact of this is not just in the sort of media sphere. How do customers act? I think we get distracted. We fall for convenience again. But it's also employees and partners and shareholders that have to be considered. I would sort of think, if we take a step back, I think of this sort of on a spectrum, if you like. That article also talked about loyalty. And I think there's almost a cancel to loyal spectrum. Those that are loyal tend to be more forgiving. They defend a company when they do make missteps. But what might be more deadly than being quote unquote canceled is that loss of loyalty. So I'll give an example. I had a very negative experience several years ago with JetBlue, where they had a code share partnership with Aer Lingus. I needed to change the JetBlue leg of the flight. They then wanted me to cancel the entire flight and book business class on Aer Lingus, which made absolutely no sense. And I upset my kids because I refused to fly JetBlue for a few years. So that was the sort of cancel extreme. Yep. I now fly JetBlue again. So I've moved from being the I will never do X, because often you're hurting yourself more than anyone else. And now I only do it when I'm compelled, when it's the only option, when it's by far the cheapest option, whatever else. So this weekend I stayed in an Airbnb. I am moving Airbnb from a brand that I've been applauding. We spoke about them recently as it related to the Ukrainian situation, and I was talking about how great they were. Based on the experience I had and the service level I received, they're being moved in my mind from a sort of loyal, I'm not going to cancel them from what I'm willing to do, but I will only now stay in an Airbnb when it's kind of the best choice versus all of these other bad choices. They've significantly gone down, which for the brand is not where they want to be, but more concerning, it's very, very hard to identify. It's hard for a brand to know where they sit in a consumer's mindset. And that to me is the kind of nuanced, more interesting part than the bright flame of everyone yelling cancer and hashtag boycott, whatever the brand is.
Yeah, the bright flame and then flaming out. It reminds me of how in society, lots of people will remember some incident that happened or some person who won American Idol or whatever. It will hit a broad swath of the population, but they'll have a very vague memory of it. So it doesn't hit as hard as some people may expect. I thought it was an interesting note from the article from Eric Wolgamuth, Chief Executive, I'm butchering that name savagely, so I really apologize. Chief Executive of Future 500, a consultancy. He was saying the success of a boycott depends on how you measure it. So a lot of the time it's like, okay, some people boycotted this brand because of X. It didn't have an effect. It did have an effect. Well, how do you measure that effect? Was it supposed to do X or achieve X? Did it achieve the goals it set out to? Because not every boycott is going to get a brand to do a 180 or make the kind of noise that people who start the boycott expect. Companies fear consumer boycotts, but activists' interest has little immediate impact on sales, writes The Economist. It points to one example, Dave, where Ukrainian officials have had choice words, to say the least, for chocolate maker Ritter Sport, who said they weren't going to pull out of Russia. For context, The Economist notes that Ritter Sport is a family-owned firm that is over 100 years old, that said it needs to continue doing business in the country, in Russia, because Russia is its second biggest market after Germany, accounting for 10% of sales. It notes that if it stopped deliveries in the country, many of its suppliers, cocoa farmers in West Africa and Latin America, would lose out. They said that we are not an international conglomerate that can simply stop some business activity here to shift to another over there. But they promised to cease advertising, investing in Russia, and donate all profits from sales there to charity. David's interesting case here because it's a company where a lot of people may see them as a big brand and they're saying, hey, like you should be doing what everyone else is doing. But when you scratch below the surface, maybe it is a bit harder for every company to just follow along with what the general consensus seems to be. Your thoughts on the Ritter Sport case study?
I sort of thought it was a very honest and nuanced response in a world that doesn't have much time for honesty and nuance. So I sort of feel for the guy to some extent, right? And I also feel like there was a lot of reaction when 60 days ago, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a lot of reaction and not all of it was particularly well thought out. From people pouring Stoli down the drain, even though Stoli is not a Russian brand, to the likes of McDonald's, for example, not owning all of their properties. And we talked about this on our Ukrainian episode. So I think that the struggle for a brand of any size is trying to both appeal to the masses, but appeal in a way that is honest and is nuanced. And that's really, really difficult to do. The other side of that article that I completely agreed with is the success depends on how you measure it. The most interesting part to me was the successful campaigns that have led to change. So they use the example of Nike and child labor, Nestle, and what's gone on in various parts of the world for various different issues. And I think that in many cases is more interesting, right? So again, on the Ukraine episode, we talked about just quote unquote pulling out of Russia is easier said than done. I can stop selling in Russia, but if my supplies come from there, I go out of business if I don't purchase from Russia, right? So there's definitely elements to which companies have to get that balance right. And often the press release covers up that nuance. And what Ritter did was tried to be a little bit more honest, I think.
So Richard Edelman, Global Chief Executive at PR giant Edelman, notes that marketers still have to judge which causes to take on. Dave, in your opinion, how do they?
The most important part here is, I think, aligning with business strategy and business values. So they need to be defined and they need to be communicated. That allows the brand to sort of create a framework to evaluate causes. but also allows them to say which causes they're not pursuing. So I interviewed the CMO of Walmart a while ago, and they talked about some of the causes that they jumped on because they fit within what they're trying to do as a business. And he used the example of voting rights was not something that fits in their values, and so they took a step back from it. The challenge is when customers don't allow you to do that. So again, I think we've spoken in the past about some of the voting rights backlash in Atlanta. All of racial tension voting rights laws were being introduced in Georgia, and companies based in Atlanta like Delta, Home Depot, and others were sort of forced to respond to a topic that they may not have wanted to. The fact there is that they had spoken out on racial issues in the past, and this was being seen as a racial issue. And so not only is it a matter of which causes am I going to take on, which causes am I going to take on and take on over time, not just when it's a hot button topic. The other thing I'll say in terms of deciding which ones to take on is there 50% of your customers that you're willing to sort of alienate? So many issues today when we're having this conversation around cancel culture and sort of the values component are pretty divisive. And so pick the topic, and there's a good chance, at least in the US, that if 50% of the country is for something, 50% is against. And so that makes it challenging for brands too. Again, they have to be true to who they are.
On that point, there was some research that according to a January 2022 Civic Science survey, 56% of Americans didn't think brands or companies should take a stand on social and political issues. 56% said, no, thank you, you shouldn't. 37% said, you should. 7% said they weren't sure. So most said you shouldn't, fair amount said you should, and some weren't sure. And it was also backed up by a worldwide YouGov survey from last year. They found similar numbers. But when you broke it down by political party, the Civic Science numbers, 15% of Republicans said that companies should take a stand on social and political issues versus 57 for Democrats who expect to see them. So just one demographic breakdown, massive difference.
So I've seen a lot of different numbers on this topic. I've been digging around trying to get what is real here. And I think part of it is we move the goalposts. So that 15% of Republicans and 57% of Democrats is probably true depending on the topic. Those numbers probably invert depending on the topic. So you could name brands we talked about recently about Goya and their CEO speaking out. You look at Chick-fil-A. These are brands that for Democrats are red rags to a bull. There is similar to Republicans that want to stand up and backlash against other companies, right? So I think it depends as much on the topic as it does the brand and what they're coming out and saying. Target didn't get a backlash from the left, it got it from the right when they opened up their bathroom to be non-gender specific, right? So I think there was a little bit more than 15% of one side that reacted to that one. So I think those numbers shift is the short answer to your question, and it depends.
Yeah. They shift, and also people, regardless of the demographic, also tend to want largely the same thing. Kind of on the face of it, there was some research showing most people, 32%, don't think a lot of social values or sustainability practices matter most when choosing a brand. I'm not making a mountain out of a molehill, but for a lot of people, it's quality, it's price, it's the things that have always mattered. But for the people who do think some of these things matter significantly, it was being transparent and trustworthy. Like we mentioned at the beginning, 26% most important. Then it was valuing employees, championing social and political issues was way further down, and then even looking for sustainable practices was further down than that. I also thought it was interesting, this was from Carla Hassan, CMO at Citigroup, who was talking about the idea of when something happens, it's often a rush to cancel it. But there was an example of Citigroup saying, hang on a second, what if we don't cancel it? What if we open up this conversation? She said, in some ways, canceling someone or something might be a way of ending a conversation that quite frankly needs to be continued in a more productive way. And I thought that was an interesting thought of going the other way, which may be a little bit more treacherous, perhaps a bit more of a minefield, but also there's a lot to be said for saying we're not just going to close the door. We're going to actually, now that this is out in the open, we're going to have this conversation.
My response to that is, it sounds like PR speak.
Yeah.
And my follow-up would be, great, how have you continued the conversation?
Yeah, what happens next? Absolutely.
It sounds deflective and one of those things that, frankly, a politician would say to change the subject. And if Citi has opened this up and has started to do things differently and taken different actions than they have in the past, I would applaud it all day long. It just sounds like a statement. Spotify didn't cancel Joe Rogan, even though there was calls for it. They rode the wave. Yes, a certain number of people probably canceled their Spotify subscription, but it's a blip. And I think the next scandal or topic or flame starts to burn and people move on.
Yeah. Miss Lentini, who we mentioned at the top of the show from Marketing Dive, she notes that the Forrester research suggests several ways brands can mitigate the risk of landing in hot water. Number one, own up to your mistakes. 41% of US online adults would go back to a brand after an apology. Number two, be indispensable, because 32% say they won't boycott a brand that is embedded in their lives. Number three, uphold company values. 22% of people say they will boycott a brand that doesn't share their values. It's all kind of stuff, Dave, that you've touched on throughout this episode, to be honest. But are there other things companies can do to mitigate risk, or is there one thing for you which is just the gold standard of approaching this?
I would start with authenticity, right? So bringing it back to what are we trying to achieve and how do we do that? Just very, very recently, there was an example of Bath and Body Works getting in hot water around Black History Month for changing the packaging on some of their products for sort of cultural misappropriation, where it just felt like we're going to slap this coloring, this iconography on our product, versus, say, Sephora, who's gotten a lot of praise for how they've gone about sort of working to increase the number of Black-owned brands that are on their shelves. Beauty is obviously something that directly affects skin, right? So they've gone about it in a very thoughtful way and brought experts and influencers in the market to help them figure out what is the right way to go and do this. So the first thing I'd say is authenticity.
Yeah.
Second thing I'd say is consistency. So this is something that needs to be over time and over the issue or issues that you're aligning with. I loved in the UK, if you have more than 250 employees, you must disclose your gender pay gap. Mm-hmm. And on International Women's Day, every British company that tweeted their support of International Women's Day, there was a bot created that responded, and it was a very matter of fact, here is the gender pay gap at this organization. In some cases, women were getting paid more. In some cases, women were getting paid 40, 50% less.
Yeah.
And so they were proclaiming their support for International Women's Day. And if you go and look at that bot, there's a lot of messages that have been pulled down as a result. But there were some that said, we got called out, we're learning, we're going to improve. And that would bring me to my third thing, which is when things go wrong, you have to acknowledge and fix it.
Yep.
We all make mistakes. And I think as consumers, we tend to be more forgiving of a brand that sort of puts their hand up and goes, yep, that was tokenism. We completely messed up. Here's what we're doing to fix it. But like that city case, mean it and follow through. Mm-hmm. And that really brings you to the whole thing, I think, which is sort of think about what's the action you're taking rather than just the message you're putting together.
Yeah.
Snapchat, last quick example, not only are they a social media, they're also a product company. Recognized in their glasses the opportunity for racial bias and acknowledged it, took steps to mitigate that. And I think they weren't out clapping themselves on the back. Yes, they acknowledged it. I don't think it was a publicity thing. I think it was we want to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. They're the things I think companies can do. But so much of it is being thoughtful rather than just jumping into, today's XYZ day, we're going to say we support XYZ. Mm-hmm. Prove it.
Yeah. Well, that's it for the lead. It's time now for the halftime report. Dave, I'll let you choose, but I feel like the last points that you made might be some of the takeaways. But any other takeaways from the first half?
I think if you look at it from the consumer point of view, you'd say consumers do or don't want you to take a stand. And generally, that's going to depend on whether you agree with them or not.
Right.
So stop trying to chase them and just do the right thing. Focus on acting rather than messaging.
Very nice. That's all we've got time for the lead. It's time now for In Other News, but first a quick word from our sponsor, mParticle. At the end of the day, your customer has to be at the center of everything you do. This starts with the right customer data strategy, as well as the right foundation to solve the challenges that typically inhibit success, such as data quality, data governance, and connectivity. mParticle is your real-time customer data infrastructure that helps you accelerate your data strategy by cleansing, visualizing, and integrating your customer data from anywhere to anywhere. Ultimately, better data leads to better decisions, better customer experiences, and better outcomes. See why the best brands choose mParticle. Go to www.mparticle.com. All right, folks, we are back. Today in other news, the B2B brands in the metaverse and in-person events are back, but not for everyone. Story 1. When Facebook rebranded as Meta back in October 2021, a lot more folks started paying attention to the metaverse. Sarah Doty, Senior Director of Strategy at Merkle B2B, recently wrote in Inc. that she thinks B2B brands, once constrained by expensive business travel and huge trade shows where you can find nobody, can now connect with business decision makers virtually via the metaverse, accessing product experts more often. Dave, in your opinion, the metaverse can be blank for B2B brands.
Real. In some respects, I think this may be a more substantial opportunity than it is for B2C.
Oh.
I think from an internal point of view, there's huge opportunity for collaboration, right? So we've all learned to work from anywhere. But I think it extends beyond sort of just quick meetings. I think it's everything from product design, learning and development, that kind of virtual training. And I don't just mean sort of sitting in a virtual meeting room. I think it's that opportunity to, quote unquote, get your hands on something, to see how things work. The opportunity for that to do from anywhere and have that experience, that immersive experience, is really interesting. I think for clients, similarly, right? The opportunity for demos to see how things work, to have different experiences. I know we'll come on to talk about events, but I'm not 100% sure on this one, but I think that there's opportunity to get a little of the in-person event experience in the virtual world when it's more immersive than when you're just sitting in front of a flat screen. I'm not 100% convinced on that, but I think there's definitely something there. So I think there's huge opportunities. I think it won't be as big and as loud, but I think that it might be more substantive.
Let's talk events. Story 2, in-person events are back, but not for everyone, writes Eva Keese of Adweek. She notes a recent survey by event marketing technology firm Splash. It found, number 1, the share of companies hosting virtual trainings grew from 2020 to 2021 from over a third to close to 2/3. The share of companies hosting virtual trainings. Number 2, on the same note, more companies are targeting their employees with virtual events than their customers. Number 3, virtual team building events fell out of favor to a certain degree. And number 4, 57% of folks attended a conference last year, 49% a networking event. Slightly more plan to attend this year, both conferences and networking events. But Dave, the current state of in-person events, in your opinion, is blank.
Renascent. I think they're coming back. I think that there's a hybrid element to many of these events. I was actually at ANA, the Association of National Advertisers, in-house agency event I spoke at last month. They had 175 people on site in person, 800 streaming.
Wow.
800 registered to stream. Right. I don't know how many streamed. You know, you've got that opportunity for asynchronous. You also have a lot of people who probably sign up and may not actually view the content, where you tend to know when people are on site that they're on site. You lose the networking effect and all those other great things about being together. According to the organizers of that event, I spoke to them just specifically about the event, and they said that doing hybrid is actually more than twice the work. Dealing with the virtual attendees, you know, the technology issues, all of those elements, it's not as easy as I had assumed it was. Maybe that's me.
Same.
I think the COVID element is still questionable. They had a lot of outdoor components to that. They had lanyards that you could choose the color of your lanyard that indicated your comfort level for social distancing, from open to hugs to keep away. But I think the most interesting thing is what it means for companies. Will they send people? Is it worth the investment both to attend, so the cost of the ticket, the cost of the flight, hotel, whatnot, but also the time? If that content is available, is it worth sending? And then if fewer and fewer people are showing up, what does that mean for the sponsorship and advertising opportunities at these events? So a lot still to be figured out, but I think just based on our colleagues and others I know in the industry, it feels like a lot more travel going on for events. And I thought you were still going to be in Austin. I'm going down there in a couple of weeks for an event that's being put on by a technology vendor. And they've deliberately made this an executive event. They're capping it at 70 people and that sort of thing. So people are experimenting with different opportunities. And I think it's going to be interesting to watch for a while.
I might see you in Austin. It's so cold up here. I don't know why I left. Anyway, that's all we've got time for today's show. Thank you, Dave, for hanging out.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to Todd, who's helping to edit the show. Thanks to everyone listening. We'll see you tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Weekly Listen, an e-marketer podcast made possible by mParticle.